Thank you so much. So good to be here again. Um, Last time I was here, we talked about cancel culture and we talked about the dangers of cancel culture and the cancel culture sort of mindset. So today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the subject of cancel culture, and we're going to try and understand some of the psychology behind cancel culture. What is the mindset? What are the emotions? What are the thought processes behind this thing that we are calling cancel culture? Because to really understand the dangers behind it, you have to understand the psychology behind it. So what I've done is I've done a little research, and I found a very good article in Psychology Today by Dr. Uptal Dulakia, who's a PhD in psychology, and he attempts to define cancel culture. And he writes a really good article about it. He says, he asked the question as the title of the article, what is cancel culture? And he says, canceling is a complex individual act that spreads to groups and can cause harm. Now, what you have to realize is that the subject of cancel culture today has become a polarizing left-right issue. It's become a liberal versus conservative issue. But really, the reality of the situation is that cancel culture should not be a left or right issue. It should be an issue of right or wrong. Is cancel culture right or is it wrong? And that's what we want to find out. So we're looking at it from a scientific perspective. We're looking at it from a medical perspective almost, and trying to find out what this doctor has to say about the psychology behind cancel culture. So he starts and he quotes somebody by the name of John Blake, and he says, just about every week we see the same story. Someone takes a jittery smartphone video of a white person caught in the act of doing something that's labeled racist. An army of online commentators mobilize. The video goes viral, and the person in the video is publicly shamed, often losing a job or being ostracized by the community, and his or her name becomes a hashtag for hate, right? And then he talks about how, you know, there are varying differences in the definition of cancel culture, which kind of causes confusion. But a lot of psychological researchers, they view cancel culture as synonymous with sort of this more and more prevalent social media activism. But it doesn't go on fully to explain the psychology behind cancel culture. For researchers, he says, defining a concept carefully and delineating its domain and boundaries is an essential step early in its study. So you really want to define something, kind of understand it. And so he goes on and he gives a good definition. He says, canceling is an individual's volitional, that means voluntary, act of publicly rejecting or actively pursuing harm against a perceived transgressor. So I like the fact that he uses the term perceived transgressor, because there's an old saying that perception is reality. Well, that's not necessarily true. And I think all of us who have been the victim of prejudice or bigotry understand that the saying perception is reality is not necessarily true. In fact, it's really unfair, because just because you perceive me or somebody else to be a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that your perception is truth, because your perception may be based on a variety of experiences that have nothing to do with who I really am in reality. So I appreciate that he said a perceived transgressor, because sometimes we look at somebody as guilty or as somebody as a transgressor or evil, who, when you really get down to the bottom line, to the brass tacks, to the meat of it, really aren't, because all this stuff is relative, right? He goes on and says, there are two parties in every canceling episode: the person who cancels, the canceler, and the entity or person, group, or organization that is canceled. Canceling requires the canceler to engage in three psychological processes, all right? So there are three psychological processes that the canceler, the person seeking to cancel a person, group, or organization, that they must go through. So here are the following three steps that the canceler goes through psychologically in order to engage in the canceling or the cancel culture. The first one is to identify or become aware of a transgression and to judge it to be significant. So you see something that someone has done, or you become aware of it, you identify this thing that they've done, and then you make a judgment that this thing is evil, and that the person who did it because they too are evil. Now, the problem with that is that it leaves no room for nuance. It leaves no room for there to be another reason why this thing happened. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the person, was ignorant of something that they said. Maybe the person was just in a bad place at the time that they said that. Maybe the person said this or did this at a time when that behavior or those words were socially acceptable. Who knows? But see, that's not what canceling does. Canceling identifies a transgression, right? And then it judges it to be significant. Now, I really enjoy reading the Bible. And I believe that the Sermon on the Mount that you'll find in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, 6, and 7 is one of the greatest writings in the history of humanity. Whether you're a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, an atheist, you can look at a lot of the principles that are espoused in the Sermon on the Mount, and you can really benefit from applying those to your life. Now, one of these principles that we talk about in the Sermon on the Mount is found in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through, I believe, 4. And it's about not judging, right? It's very important for us not to judge. Why? Because we'll never have the full story until we do our own investigation. And sometimes, even when we try to get down to the real bottom line and figure out exactly what went on, we'll never know, because maybe we weren't there and there was nobody there, nothing was filmed, right? It's just hearsay. And so sometimes the truth is really unknowable. And so it's really important for us to give people some grace, right? To treat others as we would want to be treated, to give people the benefit of the doubt, because oftentimes giving people the benefit of the doubt instead of judging their action to be significantly evil, and then them to be evil as a result, that would cancel culture. Just giving people the benefit of the doubt, a willingness to give people a second chance, a willingness to forgive people, right? But that's not what cancel culture does. The first step psychologically that the canceler goes through is that they identify or become aware of a transgression, and then they judge it to be significant. Now, I understand people in the world who maybe aren't familiar with the beautiful principles found in the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, and specifically in Matthew chapter 7, where not judging and not leaping to judgment and not being rash about your own about judging others is talked about. But I also see cancel culture happening within the church. I see Black Christians canceling white Christians because if they feel like white Christians aren't saying the right things or doing the right things in this current political climate, right? If they aren't saying Black Lives Matter or whatever, then all of a sudden they're being racist too, because silence is violence, right? So we see a lot of this going on, and it's very confusing to me how somebody who could be so familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm not just talking about church members, I'm talking about people who are ministers as well, to be having that sort of attitude. But it happens, and it's there, and some of you have seen it, and some of you may have participated in it yourselves. And if you have, guess what? There's something called grace and mercy, right? So the second step psychologically that a canceler must go through is that they have to experience strong negative emotions. So not only do you identify or become aware of a transgression and judge it to be significant and evil, and then the person to be evil for having committed that particular act, but then you have to experience a strong negative emotion. That's the second psychological step. Now, sometimes we have to understand that, not looking before we leap, being rash, being impetuous, allowing our emotions to sort of take over and drive is very dangerous, because when you allow the emotions to take over, it's like getting in the car with a drunk driver, right? You never know where you're going to end up. And oftentimes you may not end up somewhere good, right? We have a lot of admonition in the Bible, but we have a lot of admonition just in general out in the world against making rash, impetuous decisions. I went to therapy for many years and I had a very wonderful therapist. And there would be times where I was struggling with something specific and I felt very emotional, very angry, very strong in a particular moment. And I would call my therapist, even if it was the middle of the week and we had a few days before our next therapy session. And I would say, you know what? I'm really angry. I feel this way, and this way. And I'm going to do this, this, and this. And my therapist would always say the same thing. I hear you. I understand how you feel. However, I just want to ask that you do one thing. And I would say, okay, fine. What's that? Please don't make any decisions or please don't act on what you're feeling for about 48 hours. And I would say, fine, whatever. I can do that. You know why? Because in 48 hours, I'm positive that I'm going to feel the same exact way that I do now. Well, lo and behold, 48 hours would pass by and I would feel vastly different from where I did in the moment, right? You know, in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 9, it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it, right? You can't really trust your heart. When people say follow your heart, that's actually really dangerous advice because sometimes your heart, your feelings, your emotions will get you into trouble and cause you to make rash decisions. So when you experience strong emotions as a result of a perceived transgression by somebody else, you could act on those and act out in a way that you may later regret. Or if you had just let some time pass by or had done a little bit more investigation or a little bit more research, you might see, you know what, I think I had it wrong. Or maybe I should give this person the benefit of the doubt. That's the way that you have to do things. You don't want to just feel an emotion and you heard something that you think is horrible and you immediately react, right? I'm going to bring up one that I think might actually upset some people. And if it does, forgive me in advance, but this is really important. When you would talk to people about former President Donald Trump and you would if they were, let's say, not for Trump, one of the things that they would bring up is they would bring up the fact that he made a comment once talking about something that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, and a very unfortunate incident that happened. And they would say, he said there were very fine people on both sides. He was calling white supremacists very fine people. And they would take a clip out of context where he said there are very fine people on both sides. Now, if you just saw that clip, you would go, oh, that's horrible. What a racist. He's a white supremacist. Look at him emboldening white supremacists. This is supposed to be the president of all people. And look at what he's saying about these horrible white supremacists. But if you just took the time, now this is what I always do. I always look at things in context. If somebody throws a Bible verse at me, I say, oh, that's interesting. And I go and look at it in context to make sure that it means what they say it's saying, right? So when I saw that, I went and researched the clip. And then I found the press conference where he was speaking at, and I saw that particular quote in context. The interesting thing about it is that about 30 seconds after he said there were very fine people on both sides, he said, and you can go and watch this yourself, he said, I'm not talking about the white supremacists. I'm not talking about those people. White supremacy is bad and it's horrible and it should not exist. But the thing is people took that one little piece, they became very emotional, they made a judgment, and then they act on it. You see? Now, however you feel about Donald Trump is really irrelevant. I'm just using that as an example about how we can act with very little information impetuously and make a wrong judgment or a decision. Now, the final step psychologically that somebody must go through in order to cancel somebody is to then act punitively and visibly to harm the transgressor. Those are the 3 steps. You identify the transgression, judge it to be significant and evil, and the person to be evil for having done it. And then you experience strong negative emotions, and then you act on those negative emotions punitively to visibly harm the transgressor. Now, here's the thing. cancel culture begins with real or perceived a real or perceived transgression by the canceled entity that a person deems to be serious, right? And usually the transgression can be about anything, sort of like a violation of a strongly held political belief, like praising Donald Trump, for example, or like a social justice value, like tweeting something that people feel is transphobic or anti-Semitic or racist, or saying something racist to a stranger or whatever, right? Whatever the canceller deems to be significant. It could be doing something like harming an animal or whatever. But in other words, it's something that they feel is wrong. There's no conversation about why you did it, whether or not it's actually wrong. They feel it's wrong. They perceive it to be wrong, and that's enough. You see, we've gotten to the place in society where there is no more conversation. There is no more discussion. It is, you've done something, I perceive it to be wrong, therefore you're evil and horrible, and because you did this, you're probably all these other things as well, therefore it's okay for me to do whatever I do to you, because I'm morally and intellectually superior, and we need to wipe society of people like you so the ends justify the means. So the way that I cancel you and the way that I destroy your life and your livelihood and your ability to feed yourself and take care of your family, that's totally okay. The way I'm about to ruin your reputation, it's totally okay, because I'm going to bring justice. The problem with that is that's not how justice works in a free society. In a free society, we operate on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. Now, you are guilty until proven innocent, or even guilty by accusation. Sans proof. There could be no proof whatsoever to support the accusation, but just the accusation is enough for somebody to be looked upon with suspicion, oftentimes for the rest of their lives. You know, even if somebody is exonerated, even if somebody somehow manages to exonerate themselves and prove that what was said about them wasn't true, or it was misunderstood, or it was misconstrued, people will say, well, okay, I mean, so and so, yeah, that wasn't true, but they must have did something, right? Look at Johnny Depp, the actor Johnny Depp. He was married to another famous actress by the name of Amber Heard, and they had a very tumultuous marriage, as many Hollywood couples do. And she came out and she threatened him that she was going to go and tell people that he physically abused her, that he was beating her and things like that. And she did. And Johnny Depp got fired from his job playing Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. And he was pretty much canceled in Hollywood and blacklisted. And he lost a lot of money, probably multi-millions of dollars. And later on in court, it comes out that he had recorded many of the incidents between him and Amber Heard. And it turns out that she was actually the abuser. She was the one who was committing acts of domestic and physical violence. It wasn't him. And yet, even though he's been exonerated legally, in the public eye, people are still like, yeah, I don't know about that guy. You see, because this is what cancel culture does. It ruins people's reputations. And sometimes it's impossible to come back from that, because just the accusation alone is enough for people to look at you with suspicion forever. See, cancel culture is not justice. Cancel culture is vigilante justice, right? That a vigilante is somebody who goes outside of the legal system to exact judgment upon somebody who they feel to be a transgressor. And the danger about that is that all the facts may not have come out yet. Now you have canceled this person, you have harmed this person, you have ruined this person's reputation. All the facts haven't come out, and now the damage is done. The damage is done to their career, their political career, their life, their marriage, their whatever. There's so many ways that a person can be hurt by cancel culture simply because people react with this outrage. The doctor goes on and he says, a core characteristic of canceling is that to many observers, the canceler's punitive actions appear disproportionate to the magnitude of the transgression. So we talked about this last time, right? A lot of times the consequences, right, the punitive actions that the person who is being canceled is met with are far greater than what they actually did. So for a tweet, I could lose my job, my livelihood, my reputation. I could be blacklisted for a tweet that was maybe in some cases 10 years old, right? And then he says, he continues and he says, relatedly, when canceling someone, the canceler bypasses the legal due process. This is what I was just talking about, right? Vigilante justice. Somebody did something, you perceive it to be wrong and evil, and that person is evil because of it. You decide that you need to deal with that person and you judge them because you have a strong emotional reaction to it, and then you act to meet out that punishment, like you're the judge, jury, and executioner, and you go forward to cancel this person in this vigilante style justice. And that is completely outside of the legal due process. You see, the legal due process that was set up in this country was designed so that somebody can get a fair trial outside of the outrage that happens when something comes out like a crime or whatever. And how many times have we found out that innocent Black men who were accused of horrible crimes were, maybe they were, there was outrage at the time that something happened and they were convicted, but 5, 10, 20 years later it was found out that they were innocent, right? All because of the outrage that was behind that initial news story or whatever. He says, he goes on and he says, there is no complaint, no trial, no prosecution, no conviction, and no presumption of innocence until proven guilty. The canceler's judgment that the transgressor is at fault is sufficient to trigger punitive action. That's it. I mean, I don't actually need proof. I don't need due process. I don't need a conviction, no trial, no prosecution. As long as I think that you have done something and that you're at fault, that's enough for me to go ahead and cancel you. So I get together with my outraged buddies on Twitter and I begin to start hashtags. The so-and-so party is over and we're going to cancel this person, cancel so-and-so. And that's what we do, right? Makes us feel good because we're doing activism. We're fighting against evil. Is that what you're doing? Is that what cancel culture is doing? Or is cancel culture becoming the evil, right? Because a good person would say, I hear what you're saying, and that doesn't seem right, but let's take a moment, let's do some investigation, and let's make a pragmatic and logical come to a pragmatic and logical conclusion about what occurred so that we don't falsely accuse somebody or falsely imprison or label or cancel somebody. That's what a good person does. That's not what cancel culture does. Cancel culture leaps before it looks. And I'm not sure that's what a good person does. So why has cancel culture become a thing? Like, a lot of people with common sense will look at cancel culture and say, you know what, I don't really think this is a good thing. And yet it's pervasive. It is overcoming our society, right? So, and we're in the midst of it, right? It doesn't matter. And here's the funny part, you see a lot of liberals that are all about canceling, but then you have people like Al Franken, liberal, former senator, former comedian. You have Ellen DeGeneres. You have Bill Maher, right? These are staunch, hardcore liberals, and they're being canceled. They're being canceled. You got the senator from, the governor from New York, Andrew Cuomo, being canceled, right? Because cancel culture isn't just for those people. See, cancel culture will come to you as well. And so here's the thing, what we have to remember is that if cancel culture is not something that is just for those people, and it could be for me as well, maybe we should practice some restraint, right? But and here's the other thing, right? for people who are all about cancel culture, and they're all about upending somebody's lives because somebody violated the current social taboos of their community, whatever that is, right? And they're all about, using cancel culture as a form of control, using shaming, right? Using shunning, right? So a lot of people, who are all about cancel culture are from communities that have historically been shamed and shunned and things like that. And yet, when the tables are turned, they're not acting any differently. They're not acting any differently from the people that they claim were bigots and that were hateful. They're not acting any differently from the people that they claimed were being intolerant. You see, cancel culture is pure intolerance at its finest. And here's the funny part. You know, a lot of people who are very much in favor of cancel culture and have come from these historically marginalized and persecuted communities like the LGBTQ plus community, for example. One of the reasons why they hate Christians, for example, is because they felt like these Puritan standards, especially that come from religious communities and things like that, are wrong and intolerant and unloving, and so therefore, we hate them, right? Because they persecuted us. But what they've done is they've set up their own sort of Puritanism. It's not religious or biblical, but it's their own Puritanism. They set up these very rigid rules. And if you deviate from any of these rules, you will meet that mob like vigilante justice that cancel culture is so infamous for. There's a book by a woman by the name of Michelle Gelfand, and it's called Rule Makers and Rule Breakers, Tight and Loose Cultures, and the Secret Signals That Direct Our Lives. She's a psychologist. And she talks about how national and subgroup cultures differ in the degree that they're tight or loose. She says extremely tight cultures are like those found in like Pakistan and Malaysia and Singapore, and they have very clear, very strict rules, norms, and taboos to control social behavior, right? And then when a member of their society steps outside of that, deviates in any way, they're met with harsh sanctions from the government or even from just citizens, similar to online cancel culture. And when we look at the way that, we hear about women being stoned in Muslim countries for refusing to wear hijab or for being accused of being unfaithful or whatever, and there's been no due process. They've just been accused, and the woman is stoned to death. And we hear about that, and those stories break our hearts because they're horrible. And we would never want something like that in the United States. And yes, and yet that is exactly what we do with cancel culture. We just hear an accusation, we stone them via cancel culture, and mete out mob vigilante justice. And we're really no different from any of these tight cultures, as Michelle Gelfand says in her book. We're no different from any of those tight cultures and what they do. She says loose cultures, on the other hand, like Brazil, maybe a little too loose, Greece, New Zealand, they have rules, but citizens see the rules more as like guidelines or suggestions, and they allow a lot of room for social deviance and individual expression. In the Bible, there was a group known as the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were the religious rulers of the day. And they had a lot of very rigid rules, right? They thought that they were morally superior and just better people than everybody else because they could follow all these rigid rules. And if you didn't follow the rules, you were canceled, right? You weren't allowed to go to the temple. You weren't allowed to be in the synagogue. You were shunned by your neighbors. People talked about you. Who was canceled? The woman at the well, right? She would go during the hottest part of the day to get water just so that she could go and be by herself and not be talked about by all these other women because she led a lifestyle that wasn't in harmony with what they said was right. You talk about People like publicans who were tax collectors for the Romans, and they were hated by the Jews, and they were canceled. You talk about people like Zacchaeus, who had zero friends, all because of his line of work. And then you look at Jesus himself, who experienced the ultimate form of canceling, and that was death, all because he chose to step outside, to think outside of the social norms of the day. Guess what? Cancel culture is exactly what the Pharisees did. It's intolerant. It's pure, naked intolerance and bigotry. That's what cancel culture is. So you can walk around, talking about systematic racism and Black Lives Matter and all this stuff, right? But if you're canceling people, guess what? You are just as much of a bigot and just as intolerant as the people that you claim to hate, which means you're no better than them. It's really sick when you really think about it. Gelfand, she continues and she talks about how societies become tight, right? How they become very rigid. She says in her research, what she learned about how tightness develops within a group or a culture, she suggests that tightness comes from living under prolonged states of threat and attack. So nations that have suffered repeatedly throughout their history, either from alien invasion, from other groups, or even from natural disasters, they tend to become tighter, mostly out of necessity. Okay? Now, if you look at here in the US, most of the cancel culture sort of ideologies and mentalities comes from people that would probably be on the political left, right? And I don't think many people would argue that the political left has not felt under attack for some time in this country. You look at just on so many different levels, right? The unions aren't as powerful as they once were. The political right oftentimes is like really organized and better funded. The Supreme Court has shifted, very right. Then you have things like Fox News, the Tea Party. Then here comes Trump and the whole Trumpism stuff. And so the left has felt very much under attack, and they've kind of closed ranks, right? And started to institute these more clearer and clearer standards. And because they felt under attack, and the purity test to be a good person now becomes even harsher, and the sanctioning of people becomes even harsher. So because they felt under attack, they now want to create purity tests that if you're going to be a part of society, if you're going to have a job, if you're going to be able to have a career, if you're going to be a celebrity, if you're whatever, you have to stay in line with what we believe. It's puritanism and it's bigotry, and it leaves no room for other people to think differently. If you think differently than we do, you're canceled. You're canceled, right? And how much I see this in church. If I were not a better person, I would say some names, but I'm not going to do that. But I know specifically there are certain pastors and their wives who get on Facebook and who promote these cancel culture ideologies. And I just shake my head because they had no idea where this is coming from. Because this is not, Jesus was, he was like, hey, he said, they who are whole need not a physician, but they who are sick. I didn't come for the people who think they're perfect. I came to help people who were struggling. And that's why the cancel culture victims were attracted to Jesus. The publicans, the sinners, you name it. They were attracted to Jesus because he was giving them a second chance. He was willing to give them grace and be understanding that they weren't perfect, but because of the political left feeling like they're under the attack all the time, now they've gotten so rigid that there's no, you step outside. Even if you are not up with the current political correctness, the speech of the day, and you say something, it might have been right 5 minutes ago, but it's not right anymore, and you said it, so now you're in danger of being canceled, right? Who stokes this? Who stokes this fear, this constant state of alert, this constant feeling that we're under attack, that we're under siege, right? This hatred. Who stokes this anger? The media. The media. If you watch CNN, if you watch MSNBC, if you watch Fox News, if you watch this garbage, you are going to be less happy, more miserable, and more likely to become a part of the social contagion, the toxin, the disease known as cancel culture. And you're more likely to contribute to this toxic society. You know, again, I brought up the Covington kid, Nick Sandman, who was proven to be innocent, and that is proven by the fact that he's won hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits against the Washington Post and CNN and things like that. But this kid was getting death threats for months because he was canceled, because people acted without really knowing the whole thing, because being offended has become sort of a pastime of virtue signalers. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're not attaching our moral worth and our sense of self-value to being offended. And I would say this: if you have enough energy and enough time to be worried about being offended and going around canceling people, dare I say, you have too much energy and too much time. So, I just want, this is a tough topic, and I brought up a lot of things that probably may not sit well with some people, and that's okay. That's okay, because I'm okay with that. I just want to get you all to think, and I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that it gets you to think about the origin of cancel culture, the psychology behind it, and maybe make a decision to give people some grace, because there may be a day when you will need that as well.